What's up, everybody? It's me, it's Matt. How's it going? Beautiful day outside. I may go outside during the day today. It's a big moment. I'm gonna put a link up to submit your midterms after I upload these videos and put an email together to send to you guys. I've heard from some of you needing an extension. That's fine. No late penalty. Again, three things are due: an essay on Candide and Lying, the French movie about the kids in the projects. Uh, uh, these midterm questions on Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice. Look at my lectures. Watch a version of the film on YouTube or Amazon or however you watch films, and then finally there'll be some final exam questions on this story we're reading today, The Metamorphosis by Kafka, and The Doll's House by Ibsen that we talked about last week, and then some brief questions on some of the poetry in the book The Black Poets. All right, which we'll start reading from next week. Cool. Okay, so today, back to Kafka, chapter 2 of this wonderful but very strange short story. A story that exemplifies what we call modernism. This reaction, this is cultural and literary modernism, reaction against realism. But in a way, it also continues it. And you see, although there's this fantastic event and Gregor becomes a bug, everything else is shockingly realistic, almost depressingly so. Okay? And his realism was often described as close to nihilism. Nihilism means a belief in nothing, that nothing's possible, that nothing matters, that nothing, who cares? Just give up, why try? That sort of, that life is meaningless and that there's no hope for anything. Sorry, kind of a tough topic to bring up when we're all trapped inside and 10,000 people have died. I'm sorry to laugh, but it's just so absurd. And again, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to watch these videos, and I hope you're safe out there. I've heard from some of you that you're ill, that your families are ill. You know, you have my prayers, my thoughts. I wish I could do more. I hope you're seeking appropriate medical attention if you are, and that you're self-quarantining and getting lots of rest. And if you're not sick, also quarantine, stay inside. We are the epicenter of the entire pandemic in the world. It's literally in New York City and in Queens above all. So stay safe. Okay, back to this story. We saw in chapter 1, Gregor's transformed into a bug. And his first thought, again, with the realism story is he's like, oh God, my job. I hate my job. And he's like, oh God, I'm late. I gotta get to work. And all this time, it hasn't really fully dawned on him that he's not a human being anymore, that he's miraculously, by some dark, magical feat that's not really explained, become this bug-like, monstrous vermin. This giant, if you wanted to describe it, I mean, we get some things that has like a armored abdomen, so it has insect-like exoskeleton, but then more like a centipede or a millipede, it has all kinds of little tiny legs, not just like a roach that has 6 or a spider that has 8 and so on. So it's a strange, fantastical creature that he's become. It's not realistic, all right? So the play is, or the story is doing both. It's both. And I'm gonna read from my edition of the book today. I wanted to show you some of Kafka's works, actually. These are Kafka's 3 novels, all unfinished, never published in his lifetime. If you want, and this is most of his stories, but not all of them. I put the bookmark in. I was going to show you where. So So this was basically all of Kafka that was published in his lifetime, were these stories. And then this all later, and these mostly later too. Some parts of them were published, but they were essentially unfinished. The most famous of them is called The Trial. I talked about this last time. This guy's arrested, he doesn't know why. He's tried in secret courts and so on, and eventually murdered, but never gets to hear what the accusations were or defend himself really. This book, The Castle, similar kind of plot. Guys showing up in this village he's like a land surveyor, so he has some sort of government role, and he's trying to get to the castle where he can get permission to like carry out his work, and he can never get there. And you see the nihilism in both these stories. And then this one about it's called America. A little bit more light comedy. Guy leaves Europe and seeks his fortune in America and ends up in the Old West. And then the story breaks off when he's about to join the circus. Brilliant, funny, strange, kind of a mix of horror and comedy, these books, okay? And the stories too. So let's look now at the Metamorphosis and talk about the second chapter. So in the first chapter, Gregor's, becoming this creature, and he tries to go to work for some stupid reason, and his boss is there because he didn't show up to work, and they thought he had money with him, so maybe he was stealing. Boss comes, is there in the middle of the morning. It's absurd how much they're policing him, and Gregor fails to go to work, obviously, but he leaves the room at least. He is able to open this door. He goes out into the hallway, gets out, or out into the parlor, gets out there, scares the hell out of his family. Boss runs away. His father now pushes him back into the room and kind of damages him in the process. Forces him up on his side, and forces him through the door, and it hurts his side and hurts one of his legs. And you see that process repeated in the next two parts of the story. So he leaves the room again in the second part of the story. Now not to go to work, but out of a sort of courtesy to his family, okay? Out of a courtesy to his family. And then in the final part of the story, he leaves the room again for no one else but himself. And that's really the interesting, it's the same action, but the interior psychological reason for it changes, and it becomes more and more felt and personal. And he's really acting for himself at the end in a way he never has before. He's been too selfless, too living for others, living for his family. And finally, at the end, when he leaves the room, he's not anymore. But we'll get to that in the next video. So let's just start at the beginning. So if you're just right at the top of part 2 of the story, you have the PDF of it. I think that was around page 17, if I want to say, or 18. Not until it was twilight, and this is basically the next day. After his dad's thrown him back in the room, he falls asleep. Did Gregor awake out of a deep sleep, more like a swoon than a sleep, like he'd fainted. He would certainly have waked up on his own accord not much later, for he found himself sufficiently rested and well slept, but it seemed to him as if a fleeting step and a cautious shutting of the door leading into the hall had aroused him. The electric lights in the street cast a pale sheen here and there on the ceiling and the upper surfaces of the furniture, but down below, where he lay, it was dark. Slowly, awkwardly, trying out his feelers, which he now first learned to appreciate, he's getting used to his body. He pushed his way to the door to see what was happening there. His left side felt like one single, long, unpleasant, tense scar, and he'd actually limped on his 2 rows of legs. One little leg, moreover, had been severely damaged in the course of the morning's event. It was almost a miracle that only one had been damaged and trailed uselessly behind him. And again, that goes back to when his dad forced him back in. His dad's no patience for him, doesn't sees him not as his son anymore, pushes him back in the room and hurts him. He reached the door, so he's just he's like hungry and curious what's going on out in the parlor. He's trapped in his room. He had reached the door before he discovered what had really drawn him to it: the smell of food. For there stood a basin filled with fresh milk in which floated little sops of white bread. He could almost have laughed with joy, since he was now still hungrier than in the morning, and he dipped his head almost over the eyes straight into the milk. But soon in disappointment he withdrew it again. Not only did he find it difficult to feed because of his tender left side, and he could only feed with the palpitating collaboration of his whole body, he did not like the milk either. His tastes have changed. He's not human anymore. Although the milk had been his favorite dish, and that was certainly why his sister had set it there for him. Indeed, it was almost with repulsion that he turned away from the basin and crawled back to the middle of the room. He tries to eat. You see how sad it's really a word for what's happening to him. He's becoming abject. Abject means like brought low, humiliated. And he suffers immensely. Suffers. Okay? He suffers. And many people have said this makes the story Christ-like. It makes it like almost like an allegory for the suffering of Jesus, but without the same, or maybe with the same redemption. Hard to say. He could see through the crack of the door that the gas was turned on in the living room. But while usually at this time his father made a habit of reading the afternoon newspaper in a loud voice to his mother and occasionally to his sister as well, not a sound was now to be heard. Well, perhaps his father had recently given up this habit of reading aloud, which his sister had mentioned so often in conversation in her letters. But there was the same silence all around. It's afternoon, right? The morning, all this drama. He passed out. He wakes up. It's like in the afternoon. But there was a silence all around, although the flat was certainly not empty of occupants. What a quiet life our family has been leading, said Gregor to himself. He's like reflecting on what's been going on in the household. He's never there, right? He goes out and works. He doesn't know what's going on, said Gregor to himself. As he sat there motionless, staring into the darkness, he felt great pride in the fact that he had been able to provide such a life for his parents and sister in such a fine flat. And you see him, he's growing reflective. He's growing, strangely, as he becomes more abject physically, as he becomes, in other ways, he's becoming more human. Sorry, I'm getting texts. People need to leave me alone. He felt great pride in the fact that he had been able to provide such a life for his parents and sister in such fine flat. But what if all the quiet, the comfort, the contentment were now to end in horror? To keep himself from being lost in such thoughts, Gregor took refuge in movement and crawled up and down the room. So that's his new hobby. He crawls all over the walls. He's a bug. And again, that's fantastical. Bugs can only crawl on walls because of their tiny, tiny size, and they have these surface area tensions with the surfaces at small sizes where gravity isn't strong. Okay, and surface forces are. A bug his size wouldn't be able to do that. It's fantastical. It's comical. It's not realistic. Okay, but on the other hand, so much of what goes on psychologically in the story is realistic. Okay, and then it becomes clear that his sister still is going to try and be his friend. And let's just read that part. So I'm skipping ahead. I just read the first two paragraphs. 1, 2. I'm now on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th paragraph. It's the next day now, and his sister comes to check on him. And you see her love, regard, but she's a kid, so she's not very good at caring for him either. She's terrified of him. They all are. He's physically repulsive. Imagine if, I don't like any large bug, let alone one that's like, I don't know, the size of a human being almost. A great movie about that process of a transformation of a person into a bug is called The Fly, classic horror movie from the 50s. It was then remade in the 80s by the great horror director David Cronenberg, starring Jeff Goldblum, who you might know from like Jurassic Park and Independence Day and The Big Chill and all these movies. Jeff Goldblum is The Fly. Okay, so I'm starting here on the, again, that was the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th paragraph. Very early in the morning, it was still almost night. Gregor had the chance to test the strength of his new resolutions. For his sister, nearly fully dressed, opened the door from the hall and peered in. He wants to talk to them. He wants to see what's going on. She did not see him at once, yet when she caught sight of him under the sofa, well, he had to be somewhere. He couldn't have flown away, could he? She was so startled that without being able to help it, she slammed the door again. But as if regretting her behavior, she opened the door again immediately and came in on tiptoe, as if she were visiting an invalid or even a stranger. So again, she's trying to help, but then her nerves get to her. You know, her resolve fails, but then she tries to recover here. Gregor had pushed his head forward to the very edge of the sofa and watched her. Would she notice that he had left the milk standing, and not for lack of hunger? And would she bring in some other kind of food, more to his taste? If she did not do it on her own accord, he would rather starve than draw her attention to the fact, although he felt a wild impulse to dart out from under the sofa, throw himself at her feet, and beg her for something to eat. But his sister at once noticed that with surprise that the basin was still full except for a little milk, and had been spilled all around it. She lifted it immediately, not with her bare hands, true, but with the cloth, and carried it away. Gregor was wildly curious to know what she would bring instead. I always, when in those kind of sense, I picture him as like he's a monster, but he's just also just kind of becoming this adorable house pet who needs you to feed him and stuff. He was wildly curious to know what she would bring instead, and made various speculations about it. Yet what she actually did next, in the goodness of her heart, he would never have guessed at. To find out what he liked, she brought him a whole selection of food, all set out on an old newspaper. There was old half-decayed vegetables, bones from last night's supper, covered with a white sauce that had thickened. She's like, she deduced it. She inferred correctly that, oh, he's a bug now, so he's going to like food we would throw out and put in the trash. Some raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese that Gregor would have called uneatable 2 days ago, a dry roll of bread, a buttered roll, and a roll both buttered and salted. Besides all that, she sat down again on against the same basin, into which she poured some water, which was apparently to be reserved for his exclusive use. And with a fine tact, knowing that Gregor would not eat in her presence, she withdrew quickly and turned the key, to let him understand that she would take it ease, that he could take his ease as much as he liked. Gregor's legs all whizzed towards the food. You can imagine almost like a cartoon there, towards the food. His wounds must have healed completely, moreover, for he felt no disability, which amazed him and made him reflect how more than a month ago he cut one finger a little with a knife, and had still suffered pain from the wound only the day before yesterday. Am I less sensitive now? He thought, and sucked greedily at the cheese, which above all the other edibles attracted him at once and strongly. One after another, and with tears of satisfaction in his eyes, he quickly devoured the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh food, on the other hand, had no charms for him. He could not even stand the smell of it, and actually dragged away to some little distance the things he could eat. So with tears of joy, he eats the food from the trash. Again, this abject, humiliated state that he's in now, it's comical. All right, let's skip ahead. He starts eating less and less. He starts being, reflective and contemplative, but his world is getting smaller. So let's look. I'm skipping quite ahead, maybe halfway through the chapter, about halfway through the chapter. I'll read more slowly here. It's a paragraph that my translation starts on the word often. And if you're reading with me, you have a different translation than mine. This is the better one. It's in the Library of America edition, so it should be. Sorry, not Library of America. What is this? Everyman's Library, Kanam. Nice old hardbacks. Love these. Often he just lay there the long nights through without sleeping at all. So it's like times elapsed. We're talking maybe a couple weeks have gone by now. Scrambling for hours on the leather. Uh, or he nerved himself up to the great effort of pushing an armchair to the window, then crawled up on the windowsill and braced against the chair, leaned against the window panes, obviously in some recollection of a sense of freedom that looking out the window always used to give him. For in reality, day by day, there was even a little way off. Things that were even a little way off were growing dimmer to his sight. So you see, he gets to the chair, puts it up in the window, and then he crawls up there and kind of sits in the window and looks out on the world. You know, just how we all do when we're little. I mean, he's like in quarantine, essentially, guys. Okay. For in reality, day by day, things that were even a little way off were growing dimmer to his sight. His eyesight, his sensory organs are changing. The hospital across the street, which he used to execrate for being all too often before his eyes, was curse at it. He disliked seeing it so much. You know how you get sick of the same view out the window all the time? Was now quite beyond his range of vision, and if he had not known that he lived in Charlotte Street, a quiet street, but still a city street, he might have believed that his window gave on a desert waste where gray sky and gray land blended indistinguishably into one another. His quick-witted sister only needed to observe twice that the armchair stood by the window. After that, whenever she had tidied the room, she always pushed the chair back to the same place at the window and even left the inner casements open. So she notices that he goes over there and likes to sit up in the window. But then things go wrong, okay? Things start to go wrong with her. And it starts with her being very well-intentioned. She, sorry, just missed my spot. Got all excited about this story. Things start to go wrong because she notices that he loves to crawl all over the walls, and she has this idea, oh, let's take the furniture out of the room. And Gregor doesn't like that. And you can probably imagine why. Because, that's his whole identity. If they take all that stuff out of there, it's like they're taking away these things, these physical objects in his apartment, in his room, that remind him of who he is. And as I just was reading to you, his world is growing smaller, and he's not able to, help. He's not able to remember who he is, especially if you start to take everything away. Okay, so, and so the sister does this, but she does this in this strange way where she wants to take all this stuff out of the room, and she enlists the help of the mom. So the mom comes in the room now, and it leads to a very unfortunate series of events. Gregor, as they're trying to take the furniture out, at one point Gregor's like, that's it, I gotta try to stop them from doing this. And he comes out from under the sofa where he usually hides, and his sister and his mom sees it, and she faints. And then while she's fainted, his dad comes home and beats him mercilessly. So I'm going to read here on page 106 in my edition. And you remember this detail. The details are just so amazing, so like comical, humiliating, absurd, but precise. Like, there's something inimitable about Kafka. Like, he can't be imitated. It's just magical. And here's, you know what the details? The first thing he thinks of to try to say it, guess what it is? Remember last time we talked about that opening setting where it describes him physically, and then it describes his room, and it hits upon that pretty woman from the magazine he uses to sell stuff, that he put her image in a frame, put on the wall. He crawls up the wall and tries to protect the picture of the pretty girl in the frame. So here we are. And so he rushed out. The women were just leaning against the writing desk in the next room to give themselves a breather, and four times changed his direction, since he really did not know what to rescue first. Then on the wall opposite, which was already otherwise cleared, he was struck by the picture of the lady muffled in so much fur, and quickly crawled up to it and pressed himself to the glass, which was a good surface to hold on to, and comforted his hot belly. So he's finally with his beloved. He's pressing himself to this image, this two-dimensional image. He turned his head toward the door of the living room so as to observe the women when they came back. They had not allowed themselves much of a rest and were already coming. Greta had twined her arm around her mother and was almost supporting her. "Well, what shall we take now?" said Greta, looking around. Her eyes met Gregor's from the wall. She kept her composure, presumably because of her mother, bent her head down to her mother to keep her from looking up, and said, although in a fluttering, premeditated voice, "Come, hadn't we better go back to the living room for the moment?" Her intentions were clear enough to Gregor. She wanted to bestow her mother's safety and then chase him down from the wall. Well, just let her try it. He clung to his picture and would not give up. He would rather fly in Greta's face. But Greta's face succeeded in disquieting her mother. Her mother's like, "What's wrong?" Who took a step to one side, caught sight of the huge brown mass on the flower wallpaper, and before she had really conscious that what she saw was Gregor, screamed in a loud, hoarse voice, "Oh God, oh God," fell with outspread arms over the sofa as if giving up, and did not move. "Gregor," her sister said, shaking her fists and glaring at him. This was the first time she had directly addressed him since his metamorphosis. Isn't that sad? This whole time she's never tried to talk to him. And again, that shows you, she's a kid. She's trying to help, but she's really still kind of selfish. And even when she's well-intentioned, it leads to things going awry. So then he's misinterpreted here. He then sees that the sister is upset and he's made his mom faint. And his effort now is to, I'll leave the room so they can clear it. Not that good of an idea. And his dad comes in. This is, if you're in this chapter 2, this is the very last paragraph, a long paragraph. In my edition, it's almost, it's more than 2 whole pages long. And this is his father arriving home from work. And the impression he makes on Gregor now is that he's returned to life. He's gone to work, he's got a job, he's lost a little weight, he's feeling himself again. And Gregor, on the other hand, there's like an inverse proportion. As Gregor goes down, his father goes up. And it's sad, but it's not implausible given the circumstances if you're trying to write in a realistic way the way Kafka was, even though despite all the magic and supernatural occurrences. Yet his father was not in the mood to pursue such fine distinctions. That is, Gregor's trying to get back in the room, but they have the door closed. "Ah," he cried as soon as he appeared in a tone that sounded at once angry and exultant, like, "I'm going to whoop his ass now." Gregor drew his head back from the door and lifted it to look at his father. Truly, this was not the father he had imagined to himself. Admittedly, he had been too absorbed of late in his new recreation of crawling over the ceiling to take the same interest as before in what was happening elsewhere in the flat, and he ought really to have prepared for some changes. And yet, could that be his father? That man who used to lie wearily sunk in bed whenever Gregor set out on a business journey, who welcomed him back on an evening lying on a long couch in a dressing gown, who could not really rise to his feet, but only lifted his arms in greeting, and on the rare occasions when he did go out with his family on 1 or 2 Sundays a year on the highest holidays, they're Jewish, that makes it sound like, walked between Gregor and his mother, who were slow walkers anyhow, even more slowly than they did, muffled in his old gray coat, shuffling laboriously forward with the help of his crook-handled stick, which he set down most cautiously at every step. Whenever he wanted to say anything, nearly always came to a full stop and gathered his escort around him. Now he was standing there in fine shape. He used to be an old man, but now going back to work, having to earn a little money, he's been revitalized. He's been renewed by this. Such as bank messengers wear. Now he was standing there in fine shape, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, such as bank messengers wear. He's a messenger for the bank. His strong double chin bulged over the stiff high collar of his jacket. From under his bushy eyebrows, his black eyes darted fresh and penetrating glances. His one-time tangled white hair had been combed flat on either side of a shining and carefully exact parting. He pitched his cap, which bore a gold monogram, probably the badge of some bank, in a wide sweep across the whole room onto a sofa, while the tail ends of his jacket were thrown, his hands in his trouser pockets, advanced with a grim visage towards Gregor. Likely enough, he did not himself know what he meant to do. At any rate, he lifted his feet uncommonly high, and Gregor was dumbfounded at the enormous size of his shoe soles. Again, he's gonna smash him like a bug. It's crazy. But Gregor could not risk standing up to him, aware as he was from the very first day of his new life that his father believed only the severest measures suitable for dealing with him. And so he ran before his father, stopping when he stopped, and scuttling forward again when his father made any kind of move. In this way, he circled the room several times without anything decisive happening. Indeed, the whole operation did not even look like the pursuit because it was carried out so slowly. And so Gregor did not leave the floor, for he feared that his father might take it as a piece of peculiar wickedness, any excursion of his over the walls or the ceiling. All the same, he could not stay his course much longer, for while his father took one step, he had to carry out a whole series of movements. He was already beginning to feel breathless, just as his former life, his lungs had not been very dependable, and he was staggering along, trying to concentrate his energy on running, hardly keeping his eyes open, in his dazed state, never thinking of any other escape than simply going forward, and having almost forgotten that the walls were free to him, which in this room were well provided with finely carved pieces of furniture full of knobs and crevices. Suddenly, something lightly flung, landed close behind him and rolled before him. It was an apple. A second apple followed immediately. His father's throwing apples at him. Gregor came to a stop in alarm. There was no point in running on, for his father was determined to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with fruit from the dish on the sideboard and was now shying apple after apple without taking particularly good aim for the moment. The small red apples rolled about the floor as if magnetized and cannoned into each other. An apple thrown without much force grazed Gregor's back and glanced harmlessly off. But another, following immediately, landed right on his back and sank in. An apple pierces through his exoskeleton and gets stuck in his back, and it's this like kind of, the lance in the side of Christ on the cross. It's his scarlet letter that he's going to wear now. He's going to have this apple in his back for the rest of his short life. Gregor wanted to drag himself forward as if this startling, incredible pain could be left behind him, but he felt as if nailed to the spot and flattened himself out in complete disarrangement of all his senses. With his last conscious look, he saw the door of his room being torn open and his mother rushing out ahead of his screaming sister in her underbodice, for her daughter had loosened her clothing to let her breathe more freely and recover from her swoon. He saw his mother rushing toward his father, leaving one after another behind her on the floor, her loosened petticoats stumbling over her petticoats, straight to her father and embracing him in complete union with him. But here Gregor's sight began to fail. With her hands clasped around her father's neck as she begged for her son's life. It's so crazy. But you see what's happening. He's getting the suffering, the abjection, the humiliation. It's getting worse and worse and worse. And he's now at this point where, again, he tried to leave his room and his father's forced him back in, and his father's harmed him even more now. He's smashed this apple in his back, and you'll see, we'll talk about the last part. Now, the video won't be as long in this next one, but we'll talk about the third part of the story next, and the role of music in the story, and some other things like that. Okay, I'll talk to you in a minute.